Among the many survival pairs, the cook and the hunter are definitely one of the strongest. Not only can they find decent food wherever they go, but the rugged mountains of western Sierra Madre in Mexico are rich in wildlife resources. Wild vegetables and fruits can be cooked and eaten. Wild deer, raccoons, and turkeys living in the mountains can be eaten if you can hunt them. Rivers are great spots for fishing. Hunter Josh and cook Matt carry only a few basic pieces of equipment, ready to embark on a week of survival. After arriving at their drop-off location by vehicle, Josh boasted that he had seen 2 turkeys on the way there, and that they could have chicken for dinner if anything went wrong. Matt said that as long as Josh could catch it, he could cook it into a delicious meal with wild peppers and oregano. The first task in mountain survival is to find a sufficient water source. With temperatures over 30 degrees, walking in such an environment consumes a lot of water. The two failed to find a river on the mountain until they saw one at the foot of the mountain, several kilometers away, later in the afternoon than Josh had anticipated. The terrain was rough and complex, making it unlikely they would reach it before dark, so they had to spend the night on the mountain. Fortunately, while wandering around, Matt discovered a pool of water on a slope 100 meters away. The water was full of small insects, which they could boil to supplement their protein intake. Josh used a flint to spark a flame on some twigs, and after boiling the dirty water for 3 minutes, they quenched their thirst. At an altitude of 2,500 meters in the Sierra Madre, the temperature could drop below freezing at night. Josh and Matt found a rock mound where they planned to set up their shelter, using the rock wall to reflect the heat from their fire back onto themselves. With an hour left until dark, Josh went out to try his luck hunting. If he could catch game, they would have meat for dinner. He found old deer tracks in the woods but saw only squirrels on the rock piles. Fortunately, he had a slingshot. The cook, not skilled in hunting, excelled at identifying edible plants. While his partner chased squirrels, he found agave, a carbohydrate-rich plant that could be cooked properly as a dish. After some time, Josh, as expected, didn't catch anything. They found a large agave plant, removed the excess leaves, and dug out the core. They peeled it down to the white tender heart, which looked similar to an artichoke. Matt cut it into pieces and boiled it. The taste was strange, but without comment he passed it to Josh to try. The bitter and astringent taste indicated that the agave was undercooked, and its toxins were not fully broken down. So, Josh quickly vomited what he had ingested. Their first meal as partners led to the hunter getting food poisoning. Josh slept poorly and wasn't in any state to head to the river in the valley the next day. Unsure of what to do, the cook picked some pine needles, rich in vitamin C, cut them into pieces, and steeped them in a pot. After sipping some warm tea, the hunter finally showed a smile on his face. Once he felt better, he ventured into the woods with his bow and arrows. He encountered no other animals, but again came across some chattering squirrels. Josh fired stones with his slingshot, narrowly missing them. Luckily, Matt found an area with oak trees, where the ground was covered with fallen acorns. He had used these in dishes back at his restaurant. Roasted, they were fragrant and high in calories. Unfortunately, Josh returned to camp empty-handed, without any other food. They had no choice but to go to the oak area and gather the acorns from the ground. Fortunately, there were plenty of acorns, and the pair quickly collected half a pot. Raw acorns are inedible, as they contain bitter tannic acid, which needs to be roasted off. Matt took out the salt, sugar, and vinegar he had brought. He caramelized the sugar, added an appropriate amount of vinegar, then poured in the roasted acorns, stirring them well. This created a visually appealing and tasty dish of candied acorns. Josh tasted a piece and found the mix of sweet, sour, and bitter flavors perfectly balanced, fully approving of Matt's culinary skills. On the third day, they woke up full of energy. Matt crushed some acorns, added them to boiled water with some sugar, and boiled them again. Lacking only milk, the drink still tasted quite good. After a refreshing morning tea, Josh and Matt packed up their gear and headed towards a richer valley. As they descended, the vegetation grew denser and greener. Through the trees, they could see the river at the valley floor. Matt mumbled about steaks, pasta, and pork belly, anticipating a great meal ahead. When they finally reached the river, they felt they had found a wild Eden. Josh noticed fish in the river while washing his hands. He had brought fishing line and would make a rod from a cleaned branch. Turning over stones on the riverbank, he found small animals suitable for bait. Josh killed a scorpion and assembled the fishing gear. He initially wanted to use the ancient method of fei jun to cast the bait precisely in front of the fish, but the rod was too soft and long for accurate casting. Josh had to find an excuse to save face, while Matt played along and went up the mountain to gather vegetarian ingredients. While wandering on a slope, Matt found some Mexican chili peppers, cut a piece, and tasted it. It was both delicious and spicy. Josh modified the fishing rod and finally caught a fish as it was getting dark. His luck turned, and he quickly caught 3 fish, though none were very large. Still, it was enough to fill their stomachs. Seeing Josh return with fish, Matt couldn't stop smiling. He immediately took out his knife to service the fish by filleting them. While Matt was focused on the food, Josh went to check the fishing line again and found another fish, allowing them to have 2 each. 4 fish were grilled over the fire. The roe was cooked separately. Once the meat was charred and cooked to perfection, they placed it in a pot and drizzled it with a prepared sweet, sour, and spicy sauce. They finally enjoyed their first substantial protein meal of the challenge. The fish was tenderly grilled. Its natural flavors, enhanced by a sour sauce and the heat of Mexican chili peppers, clashed wonderfully in the mouth. Hunger heightened the deliciousness to an extreme level. After a tough start, the 4th morning began with the catch of 2 fish. They pan-fried the fish on a lid, retaining the tender freshness. Pouring the leftover sweet, sour, and spicy sauce from the previous night, they devoured the fish down to the bones. Unable to catch larger animals, Matt felt he couldn't fully showcase his cooking skills. Josh decided to fulfill his wish by making several snares with wire and setting them along animal trails in the forest. The next day, they were awakened by a light rain. When the weather cleared, Josh checked the traps and unexpectedly caught a raccoon, enough for a hearty meal for both. On the way back, Josh found a chili pepper tree, as they had run out of peppers Matt had previously found. He chopped down the whole tree, playfully winking at the camera. Upon returning to camp, Josh tossed the raccoon to Matt, who was waiting there. They cleaned the raccoon by the river, and Matt took care of butchering it, neatly arranging the pieces in an iron pot. After searing the meat on both sides, they added various side dishes and stewed everything under a lid for 2 hours. Meanwhile, Matt went for a swim in the river as a reward. However, he was unaware that controlling the heat on a campfire was trickier than on a gas stove. When Josh smelled the food and returned to remove the pot, the meat was nearly burnt to charcoal. He was close to tears. After his swim, Matt returned leisurely, puzzled to see the fire out. He was shocked upon lifting the lid. They salvaged the few meaty legs, scraping off the burnt parts, hoping the inside was still edible, despite the poor taste. Josh's expression said it all. Matt regretted his negligence, unable to recall when he last burnt food this badly. But he had a good partner. Josh didn't blame him and decided to hunt again, giving Matt a chance to redeem himself. Josh, equipped with a bow and arrows, traveled through the valley and forests. After a systematic search, he spotted a turkey midway up the hillside, unaware of the danger. Josh quietly approached, took aim, and shot an arrow straight into the turkey's chest. Lifting it, he exclaimed at its size, remarking how fat it was. Returning to camp after dark, Matt held the turkey, already planning how to cook it. As he plucked and gutted it by the river, Josh dug a pit and started a fire as arranged. After the fire died down, they placed the turkey in the pit, covering it with agave leaves to lock in moisture and add a plant-based aroma. Finally, they covered the pit and marked it with a stick. Slept until dawn. A full 7 to 8 hours later, Josh and Matt were unsure about how the turkey turned out. Anxiously, they dug through the sand. Fortunately, it was still very hot inside, likely not undercooked. As they carefully removed the agave leaves, their hearts finally settled. The turkey was perfectly cooked, and the legs could be torn off effortlessly, just the right tenderness. While Matt was still preparing his script, a very hungry Josh began eating. Now they could finally enjoy the long-awaited feast. Matt stripped the meat, sliced it into neat strips, and savored the tender, yet not greasy texture, which was so good they couldn't stop eating. After filling up, the challenge was successfully completed. The Rhodope Mountains in Bulgaria are known as the last wilderness in Europe. Matt focused on foraging for wild vegetables and mushrooms in the mountains, while Josh concentrated on hunting wild boar, deer, and chamois, aiming to create restaurant-quality food. They were dropped deep into the wilderness by the production crew's helicopter, carrying only the most essential survival tools. The first task was to find a water source and build shelter. There was a river at the bottom of the valley, but the mountain was very steep. Josh didn't want to risk going down and felt they could find water on the mountain. However, things often go unexpectedly. As thunderclouds gathered, they didn't have much time left to find water. Passing a few pine trees, Josh had Matt collect some of the trees down as tinder, anticipating rain at any moment. They had to descend the steep slope to camp by the river. Along the way, they navigated through fallen branches and logs. A slip and fall was a constant danger. After a tough 2.5-hour trek, the river finally came into view. They picked a clearing nearby to start building shelter, but the sound of wolves howling nearby froze Matt in place, dampening the previously light and cheerful atmosphere. Soon after, it started raining again. Josh told Matt to rest under the tarp while he took on the rest of the building work using beech and spruce branches to construct a small hut. Once the shelter was completed, the rain also stopped. Matt, carrying an iron pot, went to the river to fetch water while Josh had prepared dry wood. With the help of a flint, starting a fire wasn't too hard. They boiled the river water with beech leaves until it was ready, and a few sips of warm tea somewhat settled them. After a short rest, Josh dressed up to go hunting, staying on the mountaintop until evening. Besides finding some deer hair, he saw nothing else as the intermittent rain kept the animals hidden. The next day, with better weather, Josh left camp early for higher terrain to better spot animals. Matt, not interested in hunting, preferred to forage for wild ingredients to use as food garnishes. The mountain ground appeared covered in weeds and fallen leaves, but with careful observation, one could still find hidden delicacies like the morel mushrooms, which are delicious and require a very specific habitat. Back in Matt's hometown, they sell for 40 pounds per kilogram, yet here he found 3 at once. At the same time, Josh made a significant discovery. After patiently searching, he finally spotted several chamois on the opposite cliff, out of bow and arrow range. He quietly approached the mountain from below, trying to get closer from the side. Josh discarded all potentially noisy equipment, including his shoes. As he neared the chamois at the mountaintop, just as he was positioning himself to draw his bow, the animal turned its head, sensed the danger, and fled down the mountain. The hunter returned empty-handed, as expected. Meanwhile, Matt found some morels and sorrel. During their casual chat, Josh remarked that he could have hit the chamois, but didn't shoot because the angle prevented a lethal shot out of humanitarian considerations. Matt found this insight profound. Just when they thought they'd have to settle for a vegetarian meal today, Matt surprisingly spotted trout in the river. Without fishing line on this wilderness outing, Josh suggested he catch them by hand, massaging under their bellies to grab them unexpectedly. Half coaxed and half encouraged, Matt actually managed to catch one, and soon another, attributing his success perhaps to his chef's dexterity. Energized, he caught 3 in total. Remembering that hunting was Josh's job, he later fried the trout until golden on both sides, sliced the morels for later, and cooked them in a pot with beech leaves, finishing with a sprinkle of sorrel for a delicious protein-rich meal. The trout's firm and tasty flesh, enhanced by the morels and tangy sorrel, was incredibly delicious. During the meal, Matt heavily hinted that mushrooms cooked with other meats would taste even better. Josh just kept his head down and ate silently, his pride already wounded. That night, he couldn't sleep and left at dawn with his bow and arrows, waking Matt from his sweet dreams to tell him he might be gone a long time hunting. Josh wandered the woods, not knowing how much time had passed until he found fresh deer tracks. After yesterday's failed hunt, he decided to wait in the grassland, chewing on nearby roots to pass the time. As rain threatened again, the only animal he saw was a lizard on his quiver. After the rain, he decided to go on the offensive, knowing finding game in the vast forest wouldn't be easy. In stark contrast to Josh's experience, his partner Matt, seeing Josh hadn't returned, put on a raincoat to look for food. He hadn't walked far when he found a nest of quail eggs under a tree. Not taking all, he took 4 or 5 eggs, cooked them with the morels in a cup, and relished their unbeatable taste. Josh, watching from a high clearing, spotted a deer in the forest below. He approached from downwind to avoid alerting the deer with his scent. However, with the deer's vision far superior to humans, After tracking it for 45 minutes, it still escaped. Matt had a fruitful harvest near the camp. After eating scrambled eggs with morels, he dug up plenty of wild onions and intensely flavored thyme, along with starchy burdock, providing a substantial carbohydrate boost. Josh hoped to make a catch at dusk, but sudden dense fog severely limited visibility, and being too far from camp, he had to spend the night outdoors. He chopped down a spruce tree with his machete, carved a groove on one side of the trunk to create stable airflow between two logs for the fire, ensuring the flames lasted long. He shaved thin wood chips for kindling, tore birch bark for tinder, and struck his flint twice to produce a strong flame. Josh spent the night under the stars, extinguished the fire in the morning, and continued hunting, encountering the same issues as the day before, finding animals only to have them escape from afar. Now hungry, tired, and frustrated, he planned to return to camp for food before deciding on the next steps. However, luck turned on his way back, as Josh saw several chamois grazing on a grassland. Using bushes for cover, he successfully maneuvered behind them within shooting range and seized the opportunity to shoot an arrow, hitting one chamois in the spine and swiftly ending its life. Following New Zealand tradition, Josh stuffed grass into the animal's mouth to ensure it wouldn't hunger or thirst in the next life. 4 hours away from camp, he had to spend another night outdoors. To prevent brown bears from stealing the carcass, Josh hung the chamois's body 5 to 6 meters off the ground on a tree branch and slept hundreds of meters away. Matt, sitting by the fire and dizzy with hunger, had no idea his partner was cooking a feast. Josh, unable to resist, ate a piece of raw sheep's heart, trying a slice to see if it was edible. Finding it delicious, he ate another piece, gaining 450 calories from the entire heart, and slept comfortably until 8:30 the next morning. He then carried the chamois, eager to return to Matt and regain the respect he felt he had lost. After a morning's trek through the uneven mountain terrain, when Matt appeared, Josh quickly showed the game on his back, allowing both to smile, shake hands, and celebrate. Matt made a spit from branches, tied up the skinned and gutted chamois, and coated its skin with thyme to enhance the flavor. He could already imagine how delightful the meal would be. The entire sheep, still over 30 kilograms, was secured above the fire, its meatier legs closer to the flames, with adjustments made to the spit for even cooking. Meanwhile, Matt made a soup using morels, burdock, and wild onions to accompany the meat. After waiting 2 hours, the entire sheep was crispy on the outside and tender inside, dripping with juice. Josh the hunter enjoyed the best cuts, finding the meat alone incredibly tasty. Dipping it into the delicious, rich soup made it impossible to stop eating, each bite rewarding their taste buds. For the next 2 days, they turned into gourmet vloggers, ending the challenge with 2 sheep legs left. They packed up and left the mountains, bidding their audience goodbye until next time. In this episode, Hunter Josh and Chef Matt arrived at the mangrove swamps of Kalimantan Island. They took a small boat provided by the show's crew and carried only essential tools to survive for 7 days in the wilderness. The jungle had wild boars and wild fruits, while the waters were filled with fish, shrimp, and crabs, offering both ample opportunities to showcase their skills. They started their wilderness adventure at a designated spot where the captain had prepared another boat for their journey. Initially, they joked and laughed, but their mood quickly changed when they noticed the boat was leaking visibly. They urgently bailed water and found a place to dock. Surrounded by dense vegetation and under the high heat and humidity, there was a risk of heat stroke, but fortunately, a nearby river made it easy to fetch water. Their first priority was to build a shelter as rain seemed imminent. They chopped down several palm trees and removed the leaves. Josh taught Matt how to weave these leaves between bamboo sticks for the roof, while he focused on starting a fire to boil water for drinking. He first tried with dry palm leaves but had no success sparking a fire with his flint. Instead, he looked for alternative tinder, settling on dead branches and using his dagger to scrape off shavings. Unfortunately, the fibers were too coarse to ignite. As Matt nearly completed the shelter, Josh struggled to start the fire, but eventually succeeded with finer shavings from additional branches. In such conditions, they needed to drink at least 3 liters of water daily to stay hydrated. After much effort, they managed to boil and cool the water, but it tasted unexpectedly salty, likely due to seawater mixing in during high tide. They anticipated fresher water returning at low tide later. In the meantime, they endured and prepared to boil more water for storage by cutting more bamboo for containers. While Matt was busy cutting bamboo, Josh went out in the boat to forage. He found several snails by the river, using their meat as bait. He set up all 5 fishing lines, hoping to catch fish for breakfast the next day. In the evening, they boiled another pot of water, which, as expected, was fresh enough to drink. They replenished their water supply and stored enough for the next day. The following morning, Josh went to check the fishing lines. Approaching the river, he saw a lot of water had leaked into the boat. He attempted to flip the boat to pour out the water, but during the process, an iron pot slid off the deck into the river. Josh didn't rush to retrieve it. After he managed to empty the boat, the pot had drifted 100 meters away. By the time he leisurely rowed to find it, the iron pot had completely disappeared. Matt eagerly searched the jungle for ingredients. He saw wild ginger everywhere and thought of digging some up. It could be used both as a spice and for making tea. After tasting a small piece, he exclaimed how delicious it was. Excited, he returned to show Josh his find. However, Josh's response stopped him in his tracks, saying they could make ginger tea if they had a pot. Josh awkwardly explained, then showed Matt the catfish he caught with a fishing line, hoping to cheer him up. But Matt couldn't be happy. Without a pot to boil water or cook food, what would they do in the coming days? Fortunately, Josh had a plan. The jungle was full of bamboo, which could be used as cooking utensils, a technique learned from locals. They would cut a hole in the bamboo, put the cleaned catfish inside, mash the wild ginger, stuff it in to add flavor, and then add water. They would roast it over a fire. Due to the moisture in fresh bamboo, it wouldn't burn easily, allowing the fish to cook thoroughly. Both were eager to taste this new method. Josh carefully peeled off half of the bamboo and shared it with Matt. The fish was infused with the spicy ginger and was tender without being too fishy. However, it only provided about 300 calories, barely enough for 2 adults. Josh, experienced in hunting, needed to find larger animals. The jungle teemed with life. He saw mud on palm leaves, likely from an animal passing by, and similar mud marks on a nearby tree. Judging by the height, the animal probably weighed about 20 kilograms, possibly a wild boar. As the vegetation grew denser, Josh couldn't see the game before it heard him and fled. Thus, taking the initiative didn't work. He returned to camp and decided to make a trap. It was triangular, as long as 4 bamboo sections. He made notches at each end of the bamboo with his hunting knife and strung them together with sticks to form walls. Seeing his partner's confidence in hunting, Matt prepared a grill. He used 4 bamboo poles as posts, split young bamboo in the middle, and wove bamboo strips through the splits. This structure could support a few dozen pounds of game. With Matt's grill ready and Josh's trap set, they carried it 200 meters into the jungle. They threw crushed snails inside as bait. If a wild boar smelled and went inside to eat, it would trigger the trap and be caught by the falling door. After a night's rest, Josh and Matt checked the trap at dawn. Surprisingly, it had been triggered, but there was nothing inside. Josh guessed a wild boar had accidentally triggered it while testing the entrance. Now, they had to find another way to get food. Matt said there were macrobrachium shrimp in the river. They could make a shrimp trap, but it would depend on Josh's extensive experience. He used a technique to split the bamboo, then bent it back slightly to spread it out. Next, he connected the split bamboo to form the main body of the trap. Josh also made a funnel using rope and bamboo sticks. The principle was to tie one end of the trap shut and attach the funnel to the other end as an entrance. They used leftover fish heads as bait. Once fish, shrimp, or crabs entered, it would be hard for them to exit through the narrow entrance. Josh placed the trap in the river near their camp. On the 4th day of their challenge, despite being hungry, Josh was still jovial, while Matt wore a worried look, unsure about the trap. However, this time it didn't disappoint. The trap caught many macrobrachium shrimp. Josh rekindled the fire, while Matt went searching for ingredients. He found some sorghum ginger, which was fruitier and spicier than wild ginger, a true Southeast Asian flavor. A few steps further, he discovered some breadfruit resembling green olives and tasting like tart apples, perfect as an ingredient. They had all the shrimp from the trap. Matt neatly cut off the shrimp tails and, given the survival situation, kept the heads. He stuffed them at the bottom of the bamboo, followed by a few slices of sorghum ginger and breadfruit, then some shrimp tail meat, repeating this layering process. They added water and cooked it next to the fire. As they opened the bamboo, a delicious aroma wafted out. The shrimp meat was temptingly pink and tender. Matt couldn't wait and divided the food into 2 portions. The shrimp's freshness, enhanced by the spicy sorghum ginger and the tartness of the breadfruit, created a burst of flavors that was simply irresistible, though the portion was a bit small. Josh, having caught a catfish from the fishing line, returned and declared he would cook this time. They were still hungry, and the catfish would help a little. However, Josh's cooking was rough. He just spit on and wiped the lid clean before throwing the fish on. As Matt waited for the meal, he realized a serious issue. Josh had forgotten to secure the boat with rope, and now it was drifting away. At that moment, Matt realized that the greatest danger wasn't the crocodiles in the river, but his partner. After eating a few bites of fish, Matt informed Josh about the lost boat. Josh chose to smile awkwardly to hide his embarrassment, and quickly suggested they could make a bamboo raft to leave. After several days, the trap for wild boar was still empty. They carried it back to camp, planning to dismantle it and use parts of it for the raft. But first, they needed another big meal to regain strength. Josh led Matt to a shallow part of the river, thinking they might find clams in the mud underfoot. The two began to dig, and surprisingly, Josh actually found some, which were quite large. After groping around for about 10 minutes, they dug up several dozen clams. They hadn't checked the shrimp trap yet today. When they did, they found it full again, this time also capturing a large blue crab. Now they had enough food for a grand meal. Matt's grill was put to use. They placed the shrimp on the lid to roast beside the fire. Using a wild knife, Matt split the clams open, scooped out the meat, and put it all into a split bamboo tube to cook. Afterward, they grilled it dry and dripped in some sour breadfruit juice. The blue crab was cleaned and then fried on an iron plate. Once everything was ready, they divided the meal into 2 portions. It was time for Josh and Matt to enjoy their delicious feast. The shrimp tails were full of flavor, and the shrimp roe in the heads was exceptionally tasty. Chewing the big chunks of clam meat was incredibly satisfying, and the energy kept flowing into their bodies, making them laugh uncontrollably. After finishing their last grand meal, the next day was time to leave. They packed up and boarded the bamboo raft. Its buoyancy was just right to support them, and the catamaran structure made it more stable. As the captain who was coming to pick them up appeared in the camera, this episode of their challenge came to an end. In the southern border areas of Mexico, there is one of the world's last remaining cloud forests. This lush and vibrant area is a dream location for many survival experts. This episode featured Hunter Josh and Chef Matt, who set out to survive there for 7 days with only a few basic tools. The production crew's vehicle dropped them off at the end of the road in the deep wilderness. Josh quickly got into the groove, planning to find a campsite near a water source where animals were plentiful. The humidity in the air reached 70%, making them sweat profusely after just a few steps. Although Josh soon saw wild boar tracks on the ground, he couldn't find a water source. After trekking for 3 hours, they were on the verge of dehydration. Matt accidentally tripped while walking, a far cry from the ideal start. It was a long time before they heard the sound of water from the mountain below. Overjoyed, they found a quiet stream lying in the jungle. While Matt was busy cooling his forehead, Josh caught a crab from the stream, hinting at good animal resources in the area. They returned to the mountain and chose a flat spot to set up camp, with plenty of easily cut bamboo nearby for building shelters, a task assigned to Josh. Meanwhile, Matt took a pot to the stream to look for dinner. Turning over the stones, he pulled out the crabs hiding underneath. They varied in size, some quite plump. Matt, the gatherer, began a crazy harvest. When he returned to camp with dozens of crabs, Josh had nearly finished building the shelter. Without further ado, they started a fire, as they were both hungry by then. Matt placed the crabs in his hat for Josh to watch while he went to prepare the fennel. Unfortunately, Josh, the clumsy one, knocked the hat over, and the crabs scattered everywhere. Both scrambled to catch them, but in the confusion, Matt accidentally cut Josh. The scene quickly turned chaotic. In the humid and steamy cloud forest, wounds can easily get infected. As Josh treated his wound, Matt decided to make a delicious meal to make amends. He dumped the crabs into a hot iron pot, crushed them with a stick to a fine mash, added water, and threw in peeled and sliced fennel. Once it boiled, they had a rich and flavorful soup, nutritionally balanced. The atmosphere lightened with the soup. The following morning, having metabolized through the night, they needed to find food again. Josh went hunting with a bow and arrow. He found an animal trail with signs of wild boars, but before finding any, he spotted some birds perched on a tree. They were big enough to fill their stomachs. He shot at them but missed, possibly due to his injured hand affecting his archery skills. Despite not hitting the birds, he found plenty of wild coffee beans that tasted somewhat like plums, good for snacks, but not filling. He returned to camp to change his hunting strategy, bringing a slingshot this time for Matt to use specifically for hunting birds. After a brief demonstration by Josh, Matt practiced with the slingshot by the river. Soon, he found a large bird in the bamboo forest and hit it with a stone from the slingshot. Although he searched desperately, the dense bamboo made it impossible to find the bird. Returning to the theme of gathering wild food, Josh noticed signs of a wild boar group and decided to set a trap. It was a typical noose trap, using a bent sapling for its elasticity and a knot on a hemp rope connected to a ground pressure plate, which would trap the animal by the ankle once triggered. Back to foraging, Matt found Central American palms, which are a type of wild corn rich in starch and carbohydrates. He then encountered a waterfall with several taro plants, locally called capote. Unaware that only the root of the taro was edible, he only cut off a few leaves. Nearby, he found some wild grapes, sweet and sour, rich in vitamin C. Josh remained as steady as ever in his performance, missing the large birds in the trees. Matt returned to camp, stripped the pure taro leaves from their stems, and cut the wild corn into segments to cook into a porridge. Unaware, the hunter scooped it up and ate, praising the taste until the chef felt a burning sensation in his mouth, realizing the taro leaves were toxic. On the third day, they woke up from hunger. They had not eaten solid food since the challenge began, and their energy levels were at an all-time low. Josh made a pot of tea with the grapes, which looked good and tasted refreshing. He was confident about the trap he set the day before, expecting to catch pork by evening. Full of hope, he went to check the trap, but the greater the expectations, the greater the disappointment. It had caught nothing. Fortunately, on his way back to camp, Josh stumbled upon an iguana lying motionless on a tree. He quickly stunned it with a stick and brought it back to camp, surprising Matt. Matt swiftly planned the meal. They still had some crabs left in a sock, which he used to make soup with fennel. He gutted the iguana, roasted it on a fire, and they had a meal of both meat and soup. That night, they finally sat down to enjoy their meal. The iguana meat was firm and slightly fatty, offering a delicate and aromatic taste. They did not spare even the bones, finishing the pot of crab and fennel stew, and only feeling half full. The next morning, Josh checked the trap again, guessing that the wild boars had not passed that way. He and Matt decided to relocate the trap, exploring a new area. There, Josh found fresh boar droppings and tracks not far away. They set a new trap using nearby bamboo as the structure and vines for binding, making a 2-meter-long rectangular cage. They mashed the remaining crabs and mixed them with grapes for bait. Once an animal entered and triggered the cage door, it would trap them inside. After setting the trap, they were nearly out of energy and faced another long wait. On the 6th day of the challenge, all their hopes were on the trap. This time, the jungle was generous, and a wild boar triggered the trap, getting caught inside. To humanely dispatch it, Matt cornered the boar with a stick while Josh stabbed it in the heart, ending its life instantly. It was not a large boar, but it was enough to sustain them until the end of the challenge. Before cooking, Matt looked for some seasoning. He found a few annatto trees, whose red seeds had a unique aroma suitable for marinating dishes. He placed the tougher shoulder meat in an iron pot, searing it until golden brown before simmering it in wild grape sauce. The tender loin and ribs were prepared differently. He ground the annatto seeds, coated the pork loin and ribs, and smoked the ribs in a tripod setup while roasting the loin over charcoal. The dripping juices made it look very appetizing. They hung the legs near the fire to cook thoroughly and placed some corn by the fire as a side dish. 9 hours after killing the boar, they were ready to enjoy their feast. The pork tenderloin was roasted to a crispy exterior and juicy, flavorful interior. Wild grape sauce was used to stew pork shoulder slices. A full plate of roasted tenderloin with corn was served. From a distance, the sight was mouth-watering. The dish could definitely be considered restaurant quality. Josh couldn't wait to take a bite. The pork shoulder was infused with the aroma of grape juice, not greasy at all. Instead, various flavors collided on the palate, making one reluctant to swallow without several chews. The roasted tenderloin was particularly excellent. When they awoke, it was the day to leave. They extinguished the fire and took the remaining 2 pork legs. This challenge ended successfully. This time, the 2 came to the cold polar regions of northern Finland. Here, temperatures were dozens of degrees below zero, presenting a new challenge for them. They still brought the usual survival tools and arrived at the starting point quickly by the show's snowmobile. Upon landing, they felt the extreme cold. Finding a suitable camping spot was imperative. However, the famously thick snow here made every step sink deeply, consuming their energy and slowing them down. They struggled forward only a few hundred meters in this manner. At this rate, it might take until next year to get out. Thus, the hunter decided to make snowshoes for both. He tied cut branches side by side to distribute their weight. Their walking speed improved significantly. According to the hunter's estimation, they only needed to find a frozen lake to survive. Soon, an open area appeared ahead. The hunter immediately instructed the cook to dig down, but after digging a few times, mud and water gushed out, emitting a foul smell. It turned out to be just a cold swamp. To find their target, they had to keep moving. They continued along the forest for another 2 kilometers. Finally, a frozen lake appeared ahead. After a quick survey of the surroundings, they decided to build a shelter under a pine tree. The hunter collected soft branches for a mattress, while the cook dug a pit in the ground and evenly spread the branches inside. Making a good insulation was crucial to avoid the cold. However, the most important thing was to start a big fire, ensuring they wouldn't worry about tinder for the next few days. He then took out a flint from his bag and also brought some tinder cloth. Just a small spark was enough to start a fire. With the fire going, both felt an unprecedented warmth. The cook immediately used the pot to melt snow for drinking water. After resting by the fire for a bit, the 2 began planning for the next day, aiming to start searching for protein. Upon reaching the next day, the hunter suggested they could fish in the center of the lake as long as they could break through the ice. He then started looking for bait around the area. The fresh sawdust on the trees indicated there were juicy caterpillars inside. The first one he found was a reward for himself. The rest would later be used for fishing. He chopped a stick and sharpened its tip to use as an ice-breaking spear. With their equipment, they cautiously headed to the center of the lake. Fortunately, the ice wasn't very thick, and they quickly managed to make a large hole. The rest of the time was spent sitting by the shore, fishing at length. Meanwhile, the cook planned to search the opposite shore of the lake for food ingredients. He quickly found wild juniper berries under a tree, whose aroma could be used for grilling fish. He had hoped to find some edible blueberries on the ground, but after digging around, he found nothing. Worried that his teammate might not bring back any food, he turned his attention to pine bark, which was said to have been used as food by Finns hundreds of years ago. After peeling off the hard outer shell of the pine, the soft inner part was safe to eat. He collected a full shovel of it, and couldn't wait to get back to the camp to cook. By that time, the hunter had been guarding the lake surface for over 3 hours. Cold and shivering, he hadn't seen a single fish. Seeing that continuing like this was futile, he used branches to cover the hole and returned to the camp empty-handed. To fill their stomachs, they had to try to satisfy their hunger with tree bark, which was said to contain 6 or 7 nutrients and could supplement the trace elements needed by the human body. The cook then boiled the bark in water until soft. When he opened the lid to check, the hunter exclaimed that with such cooking skills, he should never open a restaurant. Unexpectedly, the bark was extremely unpalatable. As night fell, they stuck to the old rule of going hungry for the night. The next morning, the hunter checked the fish hooks on the lake surface, but unfortunately, they were as clean as his own face. Not finding any food made him feel very dejected. Likewise, the cook, who had hoped to find blueberries, came back empty-handed. With half a week already gone, both had persisted by just enduring hunger. It seemed the icy, snowy conditions were a significant challenge for them. On the 4th morning after getting up, they brewed pine needle tea to warm up a bit. The hunter returned to the lake to check the traps, but unfortunately, no big fish had taken the bait. Not wanting to give up, he sat at the hole and tried again. Soon there was a movement on the fish hook. Pulling it up, though the fish was not very big, a mosquito is still meat no matter how small. He continued fishing and quickly caught a second one, followed by a third. It seemed they had finally found the right spot, eventually catching 7 small bass in total. Bringing back the hard-earned catch to the camp, the cook was astonished at the size of the fish. But as both needed protein at that moment, he used an iron shovel and the collected juniper berries to pan-fry the fish. In just 2.5 minutes, a delicious meal was ready. For the first time in 5 days, they had meat, briefly boosting their energy. They ate quickly, leaving no bones behind. With renewed energy, the hunter planned to search farther for beavers, known for their meat but hard to find, typically living around river valleys. After trekking 2 kilometers, a large pile of grass appeared, clearly a beaver lodge. The hunter devised a plan to break their dam, lowering the water level to force the beavers out for repairs, giving him a hunting opportunity. He carefully approached the dam, cleared it with a stick, and waited as the water flowed out. Meanwhile, the cook ventured out to gather supplies and soon found valuable berries on a rock face, quickly gathering a large handful, along with wild lingonberries and deer grass, all safe to eat. He packaged some to take back to camp, and on the way back discovered an anthill. Normally ignored, he tried some ants, finding them sour and sweet, like lemons. The hunter had been watching the river for over 4 hours without spotting any beavers. If none appeared by nightfall, they would have to build a shelter to stay overnight. With the hunter away, the cook successfully made a fire on his first try, feeling capable again. He stir-fried the gathered deer grass, adding some sour ants, and found the taste surprisingly perfect, rich in protein and fiber, though the distant hunter couldn't taste it. As the hunter kept watch, the day turned to evening, and he had no choice but to dig a snow pit to survive the night. On the 5th day, the hunter returned empty-handed to camp, and was thrilled to see the cook had prepared a meal. After eating, they discussed their plan. Catching a beaver alone was difficult. They decided to take a shortcut to the beaver dam together, but had to cross a river, planning to fell a tree to use as a bridge. Just then, the cook slipped and fell into the icy river. With the hunter's help, he barely managed to climb out, feeling an intense chill. The hunter advised him to keep moving and use snow to dry off, but the cook was too frozen to move his limbs. Seeing the danger, they quickly returned to camp. Quickly strip and get into the sleeping bag. The hunter takes charge of building the campfire to boil water. A gulp of the piping hot water slightly soothes the cook. The remaining time is used to dry clothes. By the 6th day, the cook's wet clothes are finally dry. They check the fish hooks on the lake surface. Perhaps pity from the heavens, they finally catch a 4 to 5 pound shuttlefish. Returning to camp, the cook hurries to prepare it using local cooking methods. Meanwhile, the hunter chops wood for a chopping board and simmers wild berries in a pot until thick. He evenly spreads the mixture on the fish and sprinkles some salt on top before roasting it by the fire for half an hour. Once done, he pours the delicious jam over the fish, enhancing its flavor with the sweet and sour jam, 10 times tastier than any paper-wrapped fish sold outside. Although they didn't feast like royalty, they weren't starving throughout the challenge. Soon, it's time to go home. They quickly pack up and meet with the crew at the designated spot, ending their wilderness adventure successfully. Located in Pulautigga, off the coast of Malaysia, this uninhabited island is hot and humid year-round. For this episode, the cook and hunter must survive for 7 days on the island, managing to eat and attempt to make royal cuisine using only a few pieces of equipment and the hunter's diving gear. Known first in wilderness survival is finding a drinkable water source. However, the dense vegetation makes even walking difficult. Soon they encounter a large puddle and spot a crocodile underwater, startling them. To check if the water is drinkable, the hunter risks tasting it, only to confirm it's a salty water hole, likely filled by the tidal surge. Without food, one can last 3 days, but without water, it's risky even for a day. Continuing inland, they find a dried riverbed. If they follow the valley, they might find a pond. However, with the midday temperature rising, the cook shows signs of heat stroke, feeling dehydrated and headachy. Knowing the urgency, the hunter accelerates their pace and finds some thick vines. From over a decade of wilderness experience, he's sure they contain some fresh water. As expected, when cut, the liquid drips out, and the parched cook drinks eagerly. After a slight rehydration, they press on and soon find a small puddle of fresh water. Fearing diarrhea from drinking untreated water, they start a small fire to boil the water before satisfyingly drinking it. As the sun sets, the hunter tries to catch fish by the sea using hermit crab meat as bait, expecting rich marine resources. However, after a long attempt, not a single fish is caught. With no choice, they face hunger honestly on their first night. The next morning after waking up, the two planned to go out in search of protein. The hunter took her diving gear to fish in the sea, while the cook went around gathering usable materials. The beach was littered with human trash washed ashore, likely containing many useful items. The cook then plunged into the jungle, hoping to find some edible food. However, the island's environment was not as rich as a forest's. He found nothing edible after a long search. Meanwhile, the diver didn't fare any better. The visibility underwater was less than half a meter, making it hard to spot any fish or shrimp. Back at the camp, the cook made a good find: a tender green coconut on the beach, oddly without a coconut tree in sight. He concluded it must have washed ashore. Sure enough, upon checking the beach, he found another coconut. Shaking them, he found they still contained plenty of juice. When he returned to the camp and learned the hunter had caught nothing, the cook realized the situation was far different from what he had imagined. Not wanting to starve, the hunter collected hermit crabs from the beach, a relatively simple task. They then cracked open the coconuts to collect the water, not wasting the coconut meat either. It was time for the Michelin-starred chef to perform. He started by boiling the coconut water and meat, then added the hermit crabs. A few minutes later, the meal was ready. The hunter tasted it first, but immediately spit it out. The cook thought there was a problem with his cooking, but after tasting it himself, he grimaced in pain. The flavor was unexpectedly strong. To avoid diarrhea, they decided to continue starving. By the third day, seeing almost no resources on the island, the hunter had a bold idea: to try their luck on a small island across the water, known to be surrounded by coral reefs, which naturally attract fish. However, the two needed to build a raft, a risky endeavor. The cook felt it was too adventurous. The consequences of sinking midway were unimaginable. But seeing the hunter's serious demeanor and lacking any better ideas, he agreed to go along with it. Next, they gathered materials for the raft. Fortunately, the beach was strewn with dry bamboo and other trash like plastic bottles and fishing line, which could be useful. They used the rope they found to securely tie the bamboo poles together. After 3 to 4 hours of hard work under the sun, they finally constructed the raft's frame. By evening, they made do with some coconut meat to get by. By the 4th day, they had packed their luggage, taking the little fresh water and equipment they had left, and set off towards the small island. Surprisingly, the raft was very buoyant and moved smoothly. The two sat on the raft, chatting and laughing, and quickly covered a good distance. By noon, the temperature on the sea surface began to spike, but they had no intention of stopping. After all, there was no shade on the raft, and they were determined not to rest and expose themselves to the sun any longer than necessary. After rowing for 2.5 hours, they finally reached the shore by noon. Unfortunately, this island was even more desolate than the original, with not a single sign of life. However, their goal was not to explore the island, but to hunt the fish around the coral reefs. The hunter prepared a straight stick, tied the rubber bands from a slingshot to it, and fixed an arrowhead to create a powerful spear. With this weapon in hand, the hunter eagerly dived into the sea and began hunting the fish by aiming at them from above. After several powerful strikes, a foolish grouper was hit. Before the hunter could celebrate, he spotted a lobster under the rocks, a luxurious delicacy in the wild. He surfaced to prepare adequately, then dove back to its lair, severely wounded it with the stick, and pulled it out mercilessly with his bare hands. Finally, they could enjoy a feast. Meanwhile, the chef on the shore had found plenty of wild sea grapes, a pricey garnish in restaurants, but here, abundant and free. When the hunter returned to shore loaded with catches, the chef couldn't help but laugh, surprised at the luxurious bounty. After a simple preparation of the grouper and lobster, which also yielded numerous baby lobsters, they threw everything into a pot for a hearty stew. 30 minutes later, a delicious seafood stew was ready. The sight and smell were enticing, and the taste was incredible: soft, sweet, and rich. The hunter licked his fingers clean, not wanting to waste a drop of the flavorful juices. By the 5th day, they needed to think about returning. However, the hunter wanted to catch some fish underwater, while the chef fished from the raft. Time quickly passed, and half an hour later, the hunter had not surfaced. Even the ropes securing the raft had loosened, which greatly worried the chef. Fearing his partner might not surface, he began to loudly call the hunter's name. If something went wrong, he feared he couldn't reach the shore alone. After shouting for half an hour with no response from the hunter, the chef feared the worst. Eventually, the hunter surfaced in the distance. Learning of the chef's concern for his safety, he was touched. Although no fish were caught, both safely returned to camp and rested by the shore. The chef then went to the usual spot to collect fresh water, but discovered something valuable on the way. He found that the tops of tall palm trees were edible. Excited, the chef immediately chopped down the trunk and tasted the stem, which was incredibly crunchy and subtly sweet. However, this was not enough to satisfy their hunger. As night fell, they planned to catch some fish under the cover of darkness and went to the shore with their equipment. While searching in the water, the hunter quickly spotted a red rainbow fish and immobilized it with a stone. Together, they successfully caught it. By the 7th day, to cook their hard-earned meal, the chef searched the surroundings for side dishes. He quickly found many curry leaves on the ground, which smelled uniquely perfect for stewing. Back at camp, the chef began to show his skills by cooking the collected coconut milk until thick, then added the chopped red meat and some palm stems he had gathered. He tasted it and found the flavor impeccable. As the meal was ready, they finally sat by the shore to enjoy their food. With the slow arrival of a yacht, their survival adventure on the island came to a successful conclusion.